time, I've been doing a lot of thinking, as most of you have, about what took place in that courtroom last week and its implications beyond getting into the weeds of grand juries and jury instructions and collateral evidence and so forth and so on. Because it's so much bigger than the rules of evidence and so forth. What am I talking about? The Democrat Party. The Democrat Party's cheering what took place. Their surrogates are cheering what took place. Joe Biden went to a microphone and lied about what took place and then sneered after it. This is part and parcel of their war on the Constitution almost from day one. Almost from day one. This is the party that supported nullification and slavery. This is the party that supported separate but equal, that is segregation. This is the party that supported Jim Crow. This is the party that supports and embraces American Marxism, which rejects the Constitution and the founders and the framers. They used the 14th Amendment in order to try and prevent Donald Trump from running for president. And this is what they do. And that's what happened in New York. Let me put it to you bluntly. South Carolina was the point in which the Constitution came under attack, came to a head. It resulted in the Civil War. New York is the new South Carolina. That is the Confederacy. What do I mean by that? I'm not arguing here that there will be a violent civil war. I don't know what comes. Nobody does. What I'm arguing here is the Civil War was about slavery and about the attack on the Constitution and the attack on the Union, the nation. What took place in that courtroom? The jury should never have been impaneled. A Soros prosecutor and a Biden judge, in effect, decided that they were going to launch a war against our constitutional construct. How so? By nullifying the due process clause of the Constitution in the Fifth Amendment, by nullifying the due process clause that applies to the states through one of the post-Civil War amendments, the 14th Amendment. And if this stands, the consequences will be very dire for the future of this country and the Constitution. Let me put it to you this way. Due process goes back to the Magna Carta of 1215. But the phrase itself appears in a statute that was passed in Britain to incorporate the Magna Carta in 1354. And that was during the reign of King Edward III. And so we have this process where we have the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendments. And what do they say? With respect to due process and equal protection, they say exactly the same thing. In essence, no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. 14th Amendment was adopted by Congress in 1866. Before it was an amendment, they proposed it to the states, which then ratified it in 1868. The Fifth Amendment was added to the Constitution as part of the Bill of Rights in 1791. So this is ingrained now in our country, And what took place in the Manhattan courtroom was the first massive assault on the Union, on due process, on equal protection since the Civil War. Oh, there have been individual cases, but the impact of this, a presidential candidate, a former president, the purpose of which is to influence a national election, we've never seen anything like this. And it has now been resuscitated after we thought the Civil War put the whole idea of nullification to bed. Now, let me go further on this. Our friends at the National Constitution Center, nullification is the constitutional theory that individual states can invalidate federal laws or judicial decisions they deem unconstitutional. And it has been controversial since its inception in American history because the Constitution doesn't provide for nullification per se. Now, that said, this is even worse than nullification than we've seen in the past, nullifying federal laws. This is a nullification of 2 amendments to the federal Constitution. A nullification of amendments to the federal Constitution that basically enshrine the entire belief system in the Declaration of Independence, your right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. James Madison is considered Mr. Constitution. This issue of nullification was raised with him by a former senator, Edward Everett, And James Madison wrote a very long letter back to him on August 28, 1830. And he said this in part, being thus derived from the same source as the constitutions of the states, it has within each state, this idea of nullification, the same authority as the constitution of the state, and is as much a constitution in the strict sense of the term within the prescribed sphere as the constitutions of the states are within their respective spheres, but with the obvious and essential difference that being a compact among the states, that is the Constitution, in their highest sovereign capacity, the states adopted the Constitution, and constituting the people thereof one people for certain purposes. That is, you're a citizen of a state, but you're also a citizen of the United States under the federal Constitution. It cannot be altered or annulled at the will of the states individually, as the constitution of a state may be at its individual will. In other words, a state constitution or state legislature cannot nullify the nature of national citizenship that was adopted by states. By states. These amendments later we'll get into. It's worse in this case in Manhattan because the state as an entity is enacting. It's a piece of the state, a small piece of the state, one judge and one prosecutor. So it's worse. He says between these different constitutional governments, the one operating in all the states, the others operating separately in each, with the aggregate powers of government divided between them, it could not escape attention that controversies would arise concerning the boundaries of the jurisdictions, and that some provision ought to be made for such occurrences. A political system that does not provide for a peaceful and authoritative termination of occurring controversies would not be more than the shadow of a government. The object and end of a real government being the substitution of law and order for uncertainty and confusion and violence, which of course is exactly what Bragg and Mershon have done in their courtroom. Not the state legislature, not the governor, two people. He goes on, quote, that the Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof and all treaties made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Two, that the judges of every state shall be bound thereby by anything in the Constitution and laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Three, that the judicial power of the United States shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under the Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties made under the authority thereof. Well, the issues that took place in that courtroom arise under the federal Constitution, which is why Joe Biden, an old Confederate who supported racism and segregation, opposed Brown versus Board of Education by opposing the integration of our public school systems. That's why he got up and said, this is a state court issue. No, it happened in a state court. That doesn't make it a state court issue. Madison goes on. He says, with respect to the judicial power of the United States and the authority of the Supreme Court in relation to the boundary of jurisdiction between the federal and state governments, I may be permitted to refer to the 39th number of the Federalist for the light in which the subject was regarded by its writer, meaning him, he wrote it, at the period when the Constitution was depending, and it is believed that the same was the prevailing view then taken of it, that the same view has continued to prevail, and that it does so at this time, notwithstanding the imminent exceptions to it. He said, there is no nullification right under the Constitution, period. And what I'm saying is what took place in that Manhattan courtroom was the nullification of a part of the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment, one of the Civil War amendments. Finally, he says in part, what the fate of the Constitution of the United States would be if a small proportion of the states could expunge parts of it, particularly valued by a large majority, and have but one answer. And he meant by that a civil war. That's 1830. He could see it coming. In 1834, he wrote a long treatise on this, December, about nullification. And I'm not going to read it to you in full, but I'll read one section. It follows from no view of the subject that a nullification of a law of the U.S. can, as is now contended, belong rightfully to a single state as one of the parties to the Constitution, the state not ceasing to avow its adherence to the Constitution. A plainer contradiction in terms or a more fatal inlet of anarchy cannot be imagined. He said that New York's part of the United States of America. It's signed on to the Constitution. It can't now say, okay, but as far as the due process rights go in modern time, we're going to allow Mr. Bragg and Mr. Mershon to have their way, to basically eviscerate it, to nullify its application in that courtroom to a presidential candidate and a former president. Well, who wrote this 14th Amendment? Section 1, which is what we're focused on, of the 14th Amendment, the main author was a congressman from Ohio, Republican by the name of John Bingham. And he went to the floor of the House when he was arguing for his amendment. And he said, among other things, this is 1866, the amendment was ratified or adopted in 1868. I think, sir, that the honorable gentleman from Vermont has uttered words that ought to be considered and accepted by the gentlemen of the House when he says that the action of this Congress in its effect upon the future prosperity of the country will be felt by generations of men after we shall all have paid the debt of nature. I believe, Mr. Speaker, as I've had occasion to say more than once, that the people of the United States have entrusted to the present Congress in some sense the care of the Republic, not only for the present, but for all hereafter. Your committee, sir, would not have sent to this House for its consideration this proposition, this proposed amendment, the 14th, but for the conviction that its adoption by Congress and its ratification by the people of the United States is essential to the safety of all the people of every state. I repel the suggestion made here in the heated debate that the Joint Committee on Reconstruction or any of its members who favor this proposition seek in any form to mar the Constitution of the country or take away from any state any right that belongs to it, or from any citizen of any state any right that belongs to him under the Constitution. The proposition pending before the House is simply a proposition to arm the Congress of the United States by the consent of the people of the United States through the ratification process with the power to enforce the Bill of Rights as it stands in the Constitution today. It hath that extent and no more, he points out. He says, gentlemen, admit the force of the provisions of the Bill of Rights, that the citizens of the United States shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States in the several states, and that no person, none, shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. But they say, we are opposed to its enforcement by act of Congress under an amended Constitution as proposed. That's the sum and substance of all the argument we have heard on this subject. Why are the gentlemen opposed to the enforcement of the Bill of Rights as proposed? Because they aver it would interfere with the reserved rights of the states? Who ever before heard that any state had reserved to itself the right under the Constitution of the United States to withhold from any citizen of the United States within its limits, under any pretext whatever, any of the privileges of a citizen of the United States, or to impose upon him, no matter from what state he may have come, any burden contrary to that provision of the Constitution, which declares that the citizen shall be entitled in the several states to all the immunities of a citizen of the United States. He ends. The question is simply whether you will give by this amendment to the people of the United States the power by legislative enactment to punish officials of states for violation of the oaths enjoined upon them by their Constitution. That is the question, and the whole question. The adoption of the proposed amendment will take from the states no rights that belong to the states. They elect their legislature. They enact their laws for the punishment of crimes against life, liberty, or property. But in the event of the adoption of this amendment, if they conspire together to enact laws refusing equal protection to life, liberty, or property, that Congress is thereby vested with the power to hold them to answer before the bar of the national courts for the violation of their oaths and the rights of their fellow man. Why should it not be so? Is the Bill of Rights to stand in our Constitution hereafter, as in the past 5 years within 11 states, a mere dead letter? And therein, ladies and gentlemen, is the bottom line. Why do I want this case to get before the Supreme Court? So they have the opportunity, whether they take it or not, to give us our due process clause back, to give us our equal protection clause back. It's not up to a prosecutor and a judge, a rogue prosecutor and a rogue judge, for that matter, to destroy and nullify the due process clause of the 5th and 14th Amendment or the equal protection clause of the 5th and 14th Amendment. And we have the same Democrat Party that rejected the Constitution, the same Democrat Party that fought the due process clause, that fought the equal protection clause, the same Democrat Party that after the Civil War, despite the 5th Amendment, despite the Civil War Amendment, the 14th Amendment, still supported segregation, still supported eugenics, still supported and backed Jim Crow. And nobody's a better figure, illustration of that, than Joe Biden. Now they do it for different reasons, and they do it in a different way. But it doesn't change who they are and what they are. They hate the Constitution, as they must, as they adopt an increasingly aggressive Marxist ideology. And this party is an autocratic party, an autocratic party. It doesn't care how it gets power. What was done to Donald Trump in that courtroom, in addition to everything you heard, is an attempt to nullify the federal Constitution, due process, equal protection. That's what took place. The Democrat Party is the new Confederacy. That's right. It was the old Confederacy. Now it's the new Confederacy. Reverse federalism, where a judge and a prosecutor steal the jurisdictional power of the federal government and all that implies, the Constitution, federal election laws, and these entire processes. That is reverse federalism. That is nullification. That is the new Confederacy. That's what Joe Biden, the old Confederate, and that's what his Marxist supporters now support. This needs to be fought.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.
You need to watch this if you struggle with feeling heard. What's something people don't know about unlocking their desires? It's simpler than you think. Picture this. New York, rush hour, everybody's hustling, but sometimes you just gotta stop and ask for what you want. Jesus laid it out pretty clear. Ask and it's yours. Seek and you'll find. Knock and that door's gonna swing wide open. Now, I ain't talking about whispering into the wind here. I'm talking about the kind of asking with conviction, the kind of seeking like it's Black Friday at Macy's, and the kind of knocking that says, hey, I mean business. So what's the real secret? It's all about taking action with a capital A. You gotta be bold, you gotta be persistent, and most importantly, you gotta believe it's already yours. That's not just spirituality, that's street smart wisdom right there. So next time you're aiming for something, remember, just ask, seek, knock. And hey, don't just stand there, go get what you want.